Yeah, so The Song of the Magpie is my most recent release. It was released in September, and we're going to go to Australia today. It takes place
Ooh,
primarily in Australia. A little bit of setup is probably needed. We're going to jump into chapter 4 and the beginning of chapter 5. So, the main male character is Michael, and he is the nephew of a Scottish earl. In a previous book, at the end, he was sentenced to transportation to New South Wales for nefarious reasons. He was the villain. And we're meeting him now in this book in the sixth year of a 7-year sentence in Australia. He's just returned from a place called Moreton Bay, which was a place of secondary punishment for convicts. So if they committed a different crime in Australia during their meta sentence, they would be sentenced to a place like Moreton Bay, which was known for extremely harsh treatment of their inmates. He was there for 6 months and he's just back to Sydney. Kathleen is the heroine, and she is recently widowed. She used to be a convict. She's trying really hard to hold on to her husband's farm now that he is gone. She's finding it very difficult to operate independently in Australia because she is illiterate. She does not know how to read. So, a mutual friend of theirs, Davy Fleming, who is a grocer, has concocted a scheme in which Michael has been assigned to Kathleen as her servant for the last year of his sentence. And his assignment is to teach her to read. So we're going to pick up in chapter 4 when Michael and Davy are on their way to Kathleen's farm. Davy is essentially delivering him to her farm where he plans to spend the next year of his life, teaching her to read.
that sounds great. Take it away.
All right. When the sun reached its zenith, they stopped and sat under a towering lemon gum tree, allowing the horse to drink from a stream as they ate the meal Mrs. Fleming had packed. Dark wheaten bread with butter, boiled eggs, and spring radishes. After 6 months of plain hominy with the occasional half-rotten bit of meat, it seemed unfathomable that food could taste so good. And for a moment, when Davy got up to take a piss and Michael was alone, reclined against the white, papery bark of the tree, his nostrils full of its fresh, earthy scent, he almost felt the pleasure of it. But then Davy returned and stood over him with a raised brow and a look of pitying disapproval. Do you want to change before we get there? No, Michael answered. Michael's answer was partly because he knew better than to put himself, as dirty as he was, into clean clothes, and partly out of foolish spite. He didn't want Davy's pity. They climbed back into the wagon. Heavy silence settled between them once more as Michael packed another bowl, smoked, and glared at the pretty day. What an ass he was being. Davy deserved better. Michael pulled on his pipe and racked his mind for something to say, anything to break this intolerable tension. What's she like? His voice sounded coarse and sour in the sweet air. Davy looked at him blankly. The widow, Michael clarified. Mrs. Blackwell. Davy brightened up, clearly pleased that Michael had asked. I dinna ken her well. 'Twas by chance she wandered into the store, looking to sell her candles and honey. He paused, thinking. She's Irish. Came as a convict, though I dinna ken what she did to get here. That was no surprise. People rarely spoke of such things in the colony. I believe she came from Cork, from the city, but she knows farming. She must have had a farm before that, or her family did. Candles and honey. Michael hadn't tasted honey in years, since Darnallay. She's companionable, though a bit, Davy searched for the word, wary. I didn't get the impression she's lived an easy life. Michael grunted. People who came to New South Wales had never lived an easy life. If they had, they wouldn't be here. How old? How old is she? Davy clarified. Michael nodded. Older than us, I'd think. 'Tis hard to know. His friend was quiet for a moment. Then he turned his head to look at Michael, and his blue eyes took on an intensity Michael knew all too well. A scolding was coming. I told her you were a good man, loyal and hard-working, and I still believe it, but you must stay away from the drink, Mikey. It does you no good. Michael grunted. As irritating as it was, his friend wasn't wrong. Promise me? Mrs. Blackwell's a good woman. She needs a steady hand. Michael opened his mouth, then closed it again. He couldn't lie. He wasn't a good man, and he had very little will when it came to drink, no matter how hard he tried. So he didn't answer at all. He only glared at the road ahead and said nothing. After another half hour of oppressive silence, the wagon finally turned into a dirt drive lined by gum trees. This is it. Davy forced his lips into a false smile. A modest brick and clapboard cottage came into view, surrounded by a garden flush with spring vegetables. Chickens scratched in the yard. A barn stood to the side, and further back lay an orchard, with a cow grazing on pasture nearby. Fields sprawled in the distance, with some convict huts just beyond, and a line of trees that marked some kind of creek or river, the Hawkesbury most likely. It looked like some damn painting Father would hang in his library, then never look at again. The dull simmer of panic that had been roiling in his veins ever since Michael got off the ship swelled into a rushing torrent. He did not belong here. Chapter 5. Kathleen pulled back the curtain and peered out of her bedroom window. Beyond the smudged pane, there was still just the empty road leading out through the tunnel of gum trees, muddy from yesterday's rain. Good, she was behind. Adding new frames to the hives had taken more time than she'd expected, and she'd only just come in to change into a clean dress and finish with the candles. She glanced at the clock. 1:30. If they'd left Sydney early, as Mr. Fleming had planned, they'd arrive any minute now. She must be quick. She let the curtain fall, then hurried to the kitchen, tying on an apron as she went. She quickly stoked the fire, put the kettle on, then began carefully pulling the tapers out of the molds. Mr. Fleming had ordered 8 dozen to bring back with him, and she hadn't enough made to allow for any mistakes. It was warm in the kitchen. The sun had moved to the other side of the house, and a breeze filtered in through the open window, but it wasn't enough. A bead of sweat dripped between her shoulders. Something about this day felt frenzied, as if there were too many things to do and not enough time. But everything was in order. She'd readied the new man's room, put the kettle on, changed her dress, almost finished with the candles. There was nothing to fret about. Damn. A wick broke, leaving the wax stuck in the brass. She'd have to melt it to get it out, and there was no time for that. What was wrong with her? She usually had steadier hands. Oh well, 7 dozen and 11 it would be. Slowing down, she carefully pulled the rest of the candles, stacking them neatly on the table as she went. A gentleman. A toff. Mr. Fleming's account of Michael Dunn had been stirring in her mind all day. Was he the kind of swell who'd turn his nose up at the room she'd prepared for him? It was meant for a dairy just off the kitchen, and she used it to press honey as well. It was a lot to give up, but it wasn't large, and it was sunken into the ground, a bit musty. The bed was only straw, not the kind of place a gentleman would be accustomed to. But he'd been at Moreton Bay, hardly a place of luxury. Finally finished, she lifted an empty crate onto the table and began setting the candles in, counting as she went. 2, 4, 6, a full row. 8, 10, 12, another. Something about the scent of the candles, mixed with the sharp camphor of the gum tree leaves she used to pack them in, settled her mind. And the counting. She liked this task, the way the smooth tapers fit together when she stacked them, one layer nested perfectly on the last. 14, 16, 18. Her hands were sure at this task and quick, and the counting became a song, a lilting tune sung under her breath. 20, 22, 24. There, the crate was full. She pivoted to take up the next one. A knock sounded at the front door. Bugger, she'd almost finished. Kathleen eyed the pile of candles waiting to be packaged. Another knock came, more insistent this time. She heaved a sigh, untied her apron, and hurried toward the door. "I'm on me way," she called. She took a moment to straighten her dress, smooth her hair, and school her face into that of Mrs. Blackwell, the employer. The new man might be a gentleman, and he might be educated, but she was in charge. She'd learned from experience that it was necessary to make that clear from the start. She pulled open the heavy wooden door to reveal Mr. Fleming, hat in hand. His fist was poised as if he'd been about to knock again. Behind him stood a man. But that couldn't be, could it? Dunn, if that's who he was older than Kathleen had supposed, or he looked older. It was sometimes hard to tell with men who'd lived hard. His face was turned toward the ground, but she could make out his tan and the thick stubble of white blonde whiskers covering his cheeks and neck. He wore dirt-streaked trousers with holes at the knees, the kind that buttoned up at the side to allow for shackles, a ripped, blue-striped shirt, and flimsy shoes that his big toe had poked a hole through. He clutched a small sack. Merely a murder. What had she gotten herself into? He wore no hat. His hair was a pale yellow, almost white. Its fine curly strands blew gently in the breeze, reminding Kathleen oddly of a little boy. It looked just like her brother's hair. Wee Jerry, the youngest of the 4 she'd left behind on the streets of Cork. "Mrs. Blackwell?" Mr. Fleming cleared his throat. "'Tis a pleasure to see you again." His words sounded forced, overly polite. Kathleen started. She'd been staring at the stranger. She nodded at the shopkeep. And to you, Mr. Fleming. Mr. Fleming moved his gaze to the man standing behind him, as if inviting him into the conversation. But the convict ignored him. After an awkward pause, the shopkeep cleared his throat and looked apologetically at Kathleen. This is Mikey, Michael Dunn. He's not had a chance to clean up yet, I'm afraid. Mr. Fleming nudged the man, and he finally raised his gaze. Kathleen caught her first look at his face, and her heart sank. This would never work. Worn, ruddy skin obscured by dirt and whiskers, a hard line of a mouth, piercing blue eyes. They met hers and flashed with a lightning strike of anger and fear, as if he were a wild animal, ready to lash out at the slightest provocation. Kathleen had known men like this before, so hardened by life in the colony that they'd turned feral. They could rarely be tamed. She pinched her lips together and gave him a tight nod. Then she brought her eyes back to Mr. Fleming and forced a smile. Do come in. I was just packing up your candles. She led the two men into the sitting room, her mind racing. She could send him away. He could go back to Sydney and be the government's problem. They'd made him into what he was anyhow. It was only fair for them to deal with the consequences. But Mr. Fleming was her buyer for candles and honey, her only real contact in Sydney, and this man was his friend. If she sent him back, she'd be jeopardizing all of that. Perhaps he wasn't as bad as he appeared? The sitting room felt airless and hot. Sunlight poured through the windows. She closed the curtains, trying to bring some relief from the heat. I'll just go finish up. May I bring you some tea? She kept her attention pointedly on Mr. Fleming and away from Dunn, though an odor wafted to her in the heavy air, the pungent smell of a man gone far too long without a bath. I'd love to stay, but I canna, Mr. Fleming replied, fanning himself with his hat. I promised Emily I'd be home for a late dinner, and she does not like to be kept waiting. He winked. Kathleen smiled politely at her guest, then allowed herself another quick glance at Dunn. His blank, angry expression hadn't changed from the moment she'd opened the door. His gaze stayed trained on the cold hearth. Could he even talk? And again, that smell. Kathleen smoothed her hair. I'll just be a minute then. She tied her apron back on, strode back to the kitchen, and hurriedly packed the rest of the candles.
Wow, that was an awesome excerpt. Thank you so much for reading
Yeah.
that. I've got a lot of questions for you. I was actually writing one down as you finish. But first, we're going to take a quick break for our sponsors.